Well, I'm interviewing somebody today who is, a few days ago, was released from Lemoy prison, and he can introduce himself as he wishes to introduce himself.
I'm using the name Rusty for the purposes of this interview. As Tom quite rightly says, I was released from prison about a week or so ago. It's been quite a culture shock being out of prison, but it was quite an interesting experience on the inside, because obviously if you've never been to prison or don't know someone who is in there, you have a certain view of how it is and the kind of people who go in there, and it's very interesting to see how that changes your outlook and your experiences when you're actually going through this yourself.
Well, we, the general public, think it's somewhere between Porridge and Alcatraz, don't we? This is what we think prison is. Had you ever visited a prison before?
I'd never been to one before, actually, except, of course, I mean, any sort of sense of a museum, of course. I'd been to like ex-prisons, I suppose,
Right.
once or twice. But the idea of the sort of day-to-day routine did somewhat surprise me. I read a couple of online guides to this. The one thing I always will say to people is, if you're ever in that kind of situation, you're going to court, and it's possible you might go to prison, there are a couple of essential things that you definitely need to have with you. And I would recommend a cheap digital watch, and for goodness sake, bring some cash with you, because that means when you first get to prison, you'll be able to place calls to their family and friends hopefully right away, and also know exactly what time it was and when things are going to be happening.
Do they not have clocks around the prison? Is that something they avoid?
You usually have a clock on the computer in your cell. At the same
Right.
time, it's useful to know when you're out and about where things are happening. Also, things will happen at certain times of day. For example, you take exercise at fixed times in the morning and the afternoon. You might have certain booked appointments. So it does help you keep track of time better, and it's better for you psychologically.
Your first day in prison, was it horrendous?
Well, it's obviously a huge shock, and it's something, again, we talked about when people are not expecting to come to prison, who, that is the majority of people who never expect to end up there. And so it can be an awful culture shock. When you first get there, they'll take away your clothing, put you in prison-issued clothing, just so they can check your clothes. There's nothing degrading or anything, they need to search you. For those first couple of days, though, your family and friends will have to visit you and hand stuff in for you, as we call it, in other words, bring stuff to the prison, without having to fill the requisite paperwork. It's a really good time. Now, of course, at that particular point in time, you probably couldn't care less about this, but that's a really vital sort of window, in my opinion, for things like, if you need things like clothes and toiletries and that kind of thing.
No, I'm a political person, but I'm very concerned about trends in people who demonstrate and things like that, and people getting locked up and punished for what would have been just free speech. Now, that worries me. Now, you've been out of it for 5 years, so you're going to come back into a world where that applies much more, even in 5 years when you went away. So, the idea that freedom, I mean, you get locked away, that's the worst, that's the most perversion, isn't it? You've got no freedom, you can't do anything that you want to do, you have to do only what the system will allow you to do.
Absolutely.
And I see it getting like that. For example, I mean, I discussed with you before, I had an interview I did with somebody, it was removed by Google, removed the interview.
Indeed.
And that is frightening. And that's the sort of control, in a sense, which you have to endure in prison. Because if you communicate with certain people without permission, then that's a punishable activity, isn't it?
That's absolutely right. So the way it will work when you want to communicate with someone, you have a unique PIN code for your phone. You submit a form, which is that of a family or member or a friend. You will have to say how you know this person, what their name, address and phone number is. And the prison, for example, added you, they will call you first to make sure you're happy to speak to that person after all. But you have to be very careful of what you say. And of course, this is, I think we discussed before, a generational thing, because of course previous generations like yours and mine usually were looking to break the rules, open things out, offer more freedoms, and we come up against a new generation who try to restrict what we say and what we can do.
Well, I used to be in CND when I was a young man, and that was the norm then, to go and get yourself arrested and, get £10.
That was all part of the fun, absolutely.
That was all part of the fun. But now you face, the way they're going, quite horrendous punishments for getting involved in that sort of activity.
Absolutely. And it's a very worrying thing. Now, I've often said, I think the solution to people who you might argue are abusing free speech is yet more free speech.
Yeah.
Well, when I was campaigning myself against racism, for example, as I mentioned back in the early noughties when I was at university in the British National Party, I was all for saying that we should actually make sure this is required reading at university. We're having a debate about whether we should allow some Holocaust deniers to come to our student guild so we could debate with them. And I said it was an excellent idea. In my opinion, it's important to actually be able to get these arguments out so we can simply rubbish them and show how ridiculous they are. And I think the stake that went through the heart of the British National Party in particular is when they put their chairman, Nick Griffin, on Newsnight, and he was simply shredded by politicians at the time, Jack. So the same applies to the anti-vax movement and people who, for example, talk about trans rights. We need to have these arguments out in the open.
I think so. Well, it's just so that people can understand what the arguments are. I mean, a lot of these. I didn't have a clue. I interviewed a guy, and I just an interview was a guy I met, and the next thing I know, I've got a strike against me on Google for interviewing the guy.
Right, so, and you wonder if, for example, you'd interviewed a member of the Flat Earth Society. I don't know if you've heard of these people. Actually, believe the world is a flat disc.
Right.
And, I'd always wanted to talk to one of them because I wanted to ask them, why is ours the only flat planet in your point of opinion? Why are all the other ones round? You look at a telescope, you can see Mars, for example, is perfectly spherical, roughly spherical. This is the, and you wonder if you'd done something like that, a non-controversial but incredibly mistaken point of view, would your video have been taken down for that?
One of the themes that came out during the interviews I did do with the prisoners was about rehabilitation, of course. And I'm always mindful. I went up to see, because it was a big famous case, and it still is, the drug smuggler that they had, and they were trying to hear for an offence which didn't actually, a conspiracy to import drugs into Jersey. That was but they were punishing him on the basis of because they added up what they thought how much money he'd made from drugs back in the 70s or 80s. And he was still being punished for that. If he didn't pay them £10 million, he'd do another 10 years in jail. In fact, his case is now coming up this week, next week, to be released after all this time. And I thought, that guy's reputation in the world, he's going to be released. What's he going to do? I mean, I don't know what to believe as a fellow citizen. If I meet him in the street, he's just a person, isn't he? He's just another person. But he's a great arch international criminal, and he's dangerous. And he has done some bad things. I mean, we have to face the fact he has done some bad things.
Indeed, unfortunately served his time. And the difficulty in that case is that we're trying to demand £100 million, and as you rightly pointed out, you say, I simply don't have that money. That money has already been confiscated or
that's
gone
right, that's right.
on my defence. They say, we simply don't believe you. And of course, what are the courts supposed to do? And the question is then, what kind of burden of proof do we require in order to be able to say, this man clearly has no assets? I mean, if his bank accounts are indeed empty, it may well be the case he's got some offshore account in the Cayman Islands or Switzerland, but if there's no evidence of this, what can we do?
And it perpetuates this sort of trying to rehabilitate people back into a society, but the society isn't ready for them. The society doesn't forgive. People like that, he will, if he moves amongst criminal classes of his own sort, okay, he'd be accepted. But generally, that isn't rehabilitation, is it? That's not what it's supposed to be.
Absolutely, it does indeed beg that question. In his particular case, Mr. Warren's case, he's famous enough probably to publish his memoirs and do interviews and, of course, make a little money off the back of that. But the truth is, for the majority of criminals, there is that, particularly in a small place like Jersey, there is that possibility that people look at them and stigmatise them. And I understand completely some people may feel that is no less than they deserve, but if someone's already done their time, they're trying to move on with their life after all, it's going to be much more likely to break the law again if they are stigmatised in that way. So it's in everyone's interest, in my view, to make sure we offer them some kind of rehabilitation, give them a chance to carry on with their lives.
Well, lock them up and throw away the key is still a view that a lot of people hold without really any understanding of the case, how it comes about. I mean, you've been to prison. You've met the people out there. How many of them come from happy, prosperous, successful homes?
Indeed, it's a very good point, is that a lot of the people who end up being in prison are not there because they're innately evil or horrific people. And when people say lock them up and throw away the key, it's because, of course, they never imagine a situation where they themselves would end up in prison. But you only need to spend a little time going down the courts or reading the papers to realise that this could very easily happen. There was a case a few weeks ago, for instance, a man got into a fight with his brother. Both of them were charged with GBH against each other and, of course, were handed down a sentence. Now, I'm not advocating people getting into a tussle with members of their family, but my brother and I have come to blows in the past after all. Fortunately, no one ever saw us do it, so we're going to get facing criminal charges. But therein lies the problem. And, of course, we haven't even touched on people being falsely accused of crimes they simply did not commit. But unfortunately, these days, it's very easy to make those kind of...
Well, of course, there is no ultimate wrongful conviction court of appeal in Jersey. It doesn't exist, does it? I mean, you can try Privy Council if you can, but it costs you a fortune to get there. I mean, obviously there is a a forum in the UK for looking at
The CCRC, exactly.
exactly. They does exist. I don't suppose it helps many people, but some people, their convictions are found to be faulty.
Exactly so. Or indeed, built on the basis of unsafe evidence. Indeed, in Curtis Warren's case, for example, when he travelled to France, the Jersey police asked the French police permission to bug his
Right.
van. French police said no, his criminal record isn't sufficient grounds for you to do this, and the Jersey police bugged it anyway, and he appealed
They
on the
did.
basis that this evidence was unlawfully obtained, and the court really said, so what?
Well, his lawyer, who was represented, made a very strong case in the Jersey court that I heard him saying he'd been to the Lieutenant Governor and complained to the Lieutenant Governor. Made no difference. They said, well, we're accepting the evidence. So it makes I find it very difficult to see what's the justification for lots of the way the system behaves. And if people behave badly as a result of it, it doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, there's almost justification for it, isn't there?
If you place people in a situation with no choice but to re-offend, for instance, because we're stigmatising them. But as I said, I think the main thing I'd say to people is when you go to prison, what really struck me certainly is how ordinary people seem to be. There isn't a
Right.
case of us and them. The idea that you can say to yourself, well, I'd never go to prison myself, I'd never do anything wrong. What you actually means, you never deliberately go out of the way to harm an innocent person. You
Right.
never steal something that wasn't yours. You'd never go out to damage something, public property or something. Of course you wouldn't. But it won't stop you from being accused of things, and also it won't necessarily stop you from being in a situation where you might end up inadvertently breaking the law through thinking you're doing the right thing.
And of course, crime, fictional crime, is a huge side of entertainment. Television, you turn it on, even now, this time of day, there would be loads of crime stories being published, murders being committed on the screen. It's entertainment. People want that sort of entertainment.
Absolutely, it's a hugely popular genre, and also, of course, in terms of fiction as well, crime is overwhelmingly popular. But of course, the nice thing about what we call cosy crime, Agatha Christie, Poirot style, of course, is we usually have very serious crime and murder. We usually have a very intricate plot. At the end of the day, it all works out nice, everything's nicely resolved, and someone does so for the usual reason of sex or money. If only it were that simple in real life.
In your case, I mean, or cases generally, I don't want to discuss your case, but cases generally, are the people who are convicted, do they warrant punishment? I mean, this idea that you go to prison to be punished and the being locked away, you lose your freedom, that is the punishment. They're not supposed to torture you on top of that. But is punishment, being locked away, is that at all suitable? Is it something which can have a beneficial result?
There is not a huge amount of evidence that imprisonment actually is a particularly effective form of punishment if you look at it in terms of reoffending. Certainly community-based punishments like probation, community service, fining in particular is extremely effective form of punishment. Having said that, there's no disputing that people who harm other people should be punished. The issue, I think, is to do with making sure it doesn't happen again, preventing harm to other people, and I think that is the best way that we can try to emphasise, more of a relaxed attitude towards imprisonment. And I say relax in the sense of simply giving someone 10 years rather than 5 won't actually prevent the problem of the fact that they'll eventually be released and could go on to reoffend. You need to be able to make sure you're working with that person, providing psychology, providing education, helping them address their offending behaviour, so make sure more innocent people aren't harmed.
It is, I mean, obviously it is true to get people who go around being very vicious, being very violent, or different unacceptable activities. But it's difficult to know how you can stop them doing that. After a period, say, 5 years you won't do that anymore, or 10 years in prison you won't do that anymore.
Indeed, certainly the most prolific offenders I've met, in one case, for example, there was a man who's in his 30s now. He spent only 1 year outside prison since he turned 15. In his issue is he's a drug addict and repeatedly commits burglaries to fund his drug addiction. So he's not so much an evil, harmful person as someone who suffers from a terrible, debilitating psychological addiction. Obviously, this is partly down to things like mental health problems, of course, and what he really needs is to be sent to a rehab clinic in the UK to get his treatment. They were going to do that, unfortunately, then the COVID pandemic hit, and as expensive as it is, you have to bear in mind that on average, the average cost of the taxpayer to keep just one person in prison is £76,000 every single year. So if we're going to start saying, well, we need to do that for 10 years rather than 5, for instance, extra 5 years, we're talking huge amounts of money which could actually much more sensibly spent on things like cognitive psychology, forensic psychology, interventions in the community with social workers, probation, which actually would help prevent reoffending.
It'll be very interesting to see if anybody's doing the research. I feel sure somebody is. The effects of COVID on prison, as
Indeed.
because obviously people will be released, but there won't be the facilities because everybody is separated from, not allowed to meet. I don't know if probation officers were allowed to meet their clients. I have no idea what used to happen, but it would be an aspect, because it was also one of the things that. But we were all under detention for COVID. We were all detained in our own homes, and we weren't allowed to. Now, I don't know what the effects on people, but certainly mental health was one of the. Certainly there were problems,
Absolutely.
people being restricted. Now, that must be 10 times worse if you're restricted to a prison. Now, if you've been sent there for a relatively minor offence and you come out with a mental illness or you're no longer able to cope, that's not very useful, is it?
Certainly it's not very useful to society overall. We think it in terms of making sure this person is a productive member of society who does not go on to reoffend. It's not going to help us very much. And as you say, with that kind of isolation has become more and more common, particularly at Lemoy, simply because since COVID occurred, we have staffing levels have dropped off. And the prisoners, as I understand, the prison officers' union has been pushing back against doing loads and loads of overtime that the prisons asked them to do. So the solution, the way the prison squared that circle, is simply having people banged up behind their door in their cells much more often than they used to be. They're going to work less often. Like, for example, my own wing, we're only going to work 2 days a week rather than 5.
Right.
And that, of course, meant that there are issues in terms of isolation, lack of socialisation, and essentially lack of building up the kind of skills and interactions you need to make sure you don't actually become a threat to society anymore.
I went to a birthday party for people of my age, and they were here during they were here during the occupation, and I was, to my utter amazement, fairly conservative guys saying how lockdown was worse than the occupation.
Oh.
You said, no, obviously they were,
Imagine.
Obviously a bit of age difference. They'd aged about 60 years in the meantime. So things, but it was in their thoughts. That was their thoughts. And I thought that's very, very strange that you could actually, you were more restricted.
And perhaps, of course, the thing they missed the most, because, of course, lockdown didn't mean you couldn't have enough to eat or a roof over your head, so much as the fact you didn't have that genuine human
exactly.
contact.
That, like when you walked out of the prison doors a week ago, deep breath, I'm out.
Exactly, certainly a free man. And of course I could be with my family and friends again. The most strange thing for me, of course, has been usually the doors close at 7:30 in the evening. So I find myself sitting at 7:30 thinking, what do I do now? I usually go back to my room and go to sleep. It's been quite a novelty. But that's what's really important. Building those kind of connections is crucial.
Now, the guy I went to last week, Prison Week, he was a guy speaking. He'd served quite a few years in Winchester, I think. Right. But he tallied one day, he suddenly got the message that he'd done about 20 odd years in jail from a very young man. He had people would say it wasn't a bad childhood, but his father was in the army and they were forever moving, unsettled school, all these ingredients which you looked at and say, well, what's the harm in that? Absolutely. But that is the sort of thing which sets people off, doesn't it? So he had no real friends. Childhood wasn't like a Walt Disney childhood. It wasn't like that.
Indeed.
Now somehow or other, he found prayer as being an answer to his problem.
That works for others.
So I don't know obviously the hundreds of people he must have met in the prison service whilst he was serving in prison. I don't know what's happened to all those, but he's one of the few. But it wasn't actually prison itself that reformed him. It was a Christian view from somewhere. He picked up a Christian view. Now, that's not what prisons are geared up for, are they? I mean, is that noticeably a factor? Do they try to turn you into good Christians? Is that what they try to do?
We have a weekly chapel service, and the chaplains are there to support us. But there's no particular attempt at evangelism. It's simply a voluntary arrangement. Having said that, the Alpha course, as I understand, is insanely popular in UK prisons.
Really?
It's been very useful. But then I think you've touched on the actual answer to that. Perhaps because it is one of the very few social outlets you can have in prison, where you can actually have some degree of interaction with others, a combined activity. Perhaps that's why prisons tend to latch onto it more than perhaps people would on the outside.
Because I went to hear him talking in the church, and it was very good. He's an extraordinarily good speaker. But the church was full up with people. There were adults and children, all ages. Now, it was normal. It was quite normal, especially for people who go to church. I'm not a church goer, but it was a community, and he was part of the community. He'd been welcomed in, and they obviously the church. He was a good advert for the church because he was somebody who'd found God in prayer and so on.
The Damascene conversion, absolutely indeed.
Absolutely, but if you don't find that in prison and you come out like you came out. The door opens, out you go. They give you how much they give you to come out.
I got £30. That's right.
£30. Face the world with 30 quid. I mean, I don't know what does the prison service expect you to do?
Well, so I would say, in fairness, and the chaplaincy team were incredibly kind and supportive throughout my time. They were wonderful. They didn't expect me to evangelise at any time. And in fact, just before my sentencing, one of the chaplains came to me and said he'd like to say a quick prayer. And I said, well, if there was ever a time. But having said that, as you say, if you simply give someone a handshake and wish them the best of luck, it's hardly surprising that over half of the people out in the Moy now have been there previously. If we've made no attempt to address underlying psychological issues, things to do with addiction to drink, to drugs and that kind of thing, we're not going to really make much progress in helping them address their behaviour, except in the very mundane sense that whilst they're in prison, there are certain crimes they simply can't commit.
Have you seen, what's the 5 years or so you were there, have you seen people go out and come back again?
Oh, many times, absolutely.
Really?
I mean, we had one chap, for example, he's a homeless chap, he's a drinker, and he essentially was using prison as a sort of form of rehab as far as we could see. He regularly would simply go to the police station, take his clothes off deliberately, so he'd be arrested and brought up to prison, where he'd stay for a few weeks for a decent exposure, and then, of course, be released again. But essentially his real problem was to do with the drink and the fact he was homeless. So, and certainly with the right amount of support from a social worker, housing and so on and so forth, which apparently he did have at one stage, he would have been absolutely fine. He wouldn't have to come back.
Well, I remember a case many, many years ago when the guy who was a drinker, and it came up towards Christmas, and he said to the magistrate, lock me away because it's Christmas, I get looked after at Christmas. And that's what they did, so they locked him away for Christmas.
Absolutely, exactly so. And of course, it was something I was teasing one of my fellow prisoners about because I was touching wood, I'm hoping to be out for Christmas. Still it's out of prison. But of course you get a small little goodie bag, or brown paper bag containing a mince pie, a bit of stol, and a Capri Sun orange juice occasionally, not every single year, but I won't dwell on that after all. And a few other little goodies, of course, that you wouldn't normally get at any other time of year. So this is the one consolation you get.
You've still got family here.
I do, that's right. Absolutely.
You are a writer, you can write. You're restricted on using computers, which could impact on writing, obviously, computers.
Hugely, absolutely.
Not many people using quill pens these days.
Sadly, no, and believe me, I'd love to break up my Olivetti typewriter. I'm staying at a hotel, and I don't think other guests would thank me for that with the clickety-clack of the keys.
No. And the little typewriter shop, Mr. Wood, of course, he's no longer there, next to the Odeon. He used to
yes, so these days, Jersey really has changed in all this time.
That's right.
And yes, I mean, this is, of course, specifically for people who have been accused of, or at least convicted of a sexual offence. There are certain restrictions they have to face, which are more onerous than, say, had you been in for example, for drugs. Right. And part of these are the police must approve any address to which you go and live. In my own case, I have to have someone supervising me when I'm using the internet, though I hope to get that appealed at the Royal Court.
Because you're a writer, are you going to write about your experiences? And you can't just blank it out your mind. It's happened, it's affected you. 5 years in jail. Is there something you want to write about?
I certainly would like to write an open letter to the Home Affairs Minister, which I'd like to publish on the internet, rather than probably my own personal prison memoirs. To simply talk about how we could make our time in prison more effective, to focus on rehabilitation. In particular, we talked before about the fact we have computers in our cells, so we could do so much more with educational activities like programs and videos. And throughout my entire time in prison, I bombarded our education department with suggestions saying, for example, let's get programs in to help people learn to code, or let's get some educational videos like TED Talks or the Book of Life on our system, or some tutorials of painting or knitting. And there wasn't really very much uptake on that, so something like that would be really
well, of course, our government is committed to a computer society. They want eGov and all those things. They don't want people to be writing tedious letters. They want it all on tap, tap, tap on the computer.
It's been a real difficulty for me, I must say, going through the benefits system of applying for income support, because a lot of the time they've said to me, it's okay, just pop onto our website, you can get your tax number there, or apply there, or change your email address. I had to say, look, sorry, I can't use a computer, you're going to have to do it by pound money. The staff were extraordinarily kind and sympathetic, but of course...
Did you have to explain why?
Yes, I had to explain why to three complete strangers about the nature of my conviction.
And have you got when you're doing that, are you somewhere private in Social Security or wherever, which department?
I was at the front desk, but they were fairly subtle about the whole thing. But I was lucky to meet three members of staff who were extraordinarily kind and sympathetic. But it's certainly something I wouldn't recommend for everyone to do, because you never know who might be overhearing that sort of thing.
Yes, indeed. Of course.
The frustrating thing for me really is the fact that under current Government of Jersey rules, you can't begin your application to apply for income support help with accommodation until the day you're actually released from prison. So of course you might be in prison, as I was, for 5 years, and have all the time in the world, and say apply 12 months in advance so everything's ready for you. That's a great idea in theory, but they say no, sorry, we can only really get the ball rolling once you're out.
What would you do then? What you've been there, you've experienced it. The Home Affairs Minister is listening to you. What would be your first priority? Say, this is what you need to change.
Certainly the biggest thing I would say is, I mean, the golden rule I've always maintained about prison should be, we understand the situation, you might have broken the law, they might have you banged to rights, but for goodness sake, let's not do anything to make prison any more difficult than it has to be. That's the first thing I'd say. And that includes things like, for example, making sure that prisoners have good contact with friends and family, they can get the items they need, particularly things like medical devices, so on. But I would also stress the importance of purposeful activity while they're in here. Let people do something which will help pass the time, learn meaningful skills, hopefully things they can apply on the outside in order to move on with their life when they get out. This right here will not only stop them reoffending, or save the taxpayer a fortune and reduce the number of people who are victims of crime. So everyone wins as a result of that.
Do you have any success stories, people who've been through the system and they've come out? I mean, this guy I went to hear, and he spoke extremely well. His family's back together, and he's got, old family who wouldn't speak to him or speaking to him again, all these sorts of things. Everything's going well at the moment. Now, do you meet people like that? I mean, you've got family to go to in Jersey.
My family who support me. Now, I actually bumped into a guy the day who'd been in for unfortunately I have restrictions about who I can contact and who I can't, so I can't look up people who've been convicted of a sexual offence, but I was able to speak to a man who hadn't been just got out of prison. He told me a friend of his had actually arranged a job for him. He was moving on with his life, which is really good because he'd been in and out of prison for about 10 years, and fortunately again he had a friend who was able to set him up with some work. And I have spoken to a couple of other people. For instance, one chap had nowhere to go when he got out, and it turned out that a prison officer actually had a friend who helped him find somewhere to stay. In another case, a prisoner's girlfriend actually offered this chap a sofa to stay on in the meantime. So there are some kind of success stories here, but it's quite clear that there's a lot more the prison and the government generally could be doing to help make sure they're housing and supporting people when they get out.
Well, rehabilitation, this one word which is supposed to mean so much, is actually on the agenda for the plans that the government has now put out in Jersey. Improving the rehabilitation system is one of their objectives. Now, whether that will happen, of course, time will tell. But it's a start, isn't it?
It certainly is. The idea they support this idea in principle. They recently had an event where they were examining the Scandinavian model or the Norwegian model, and in particular, for example, a lot of Norwegian prisons will bring in teachers from local high schools to help teach basic classes, like our equivalent of what would be GCSE or O level, as it would have been in your day, of course, and A level, to make sure people get qualifications. But not only that, when they get their exam certificate, it says the name of the local school, and it doesn't say prison anywhere on it. So you then have a qualification, and no one will know you simply obtained that in prison. That's a really crucial thing to have. And we've done similar things with Highlands College in the past, things like horticultural certificates, but we could do so much more with this.
At what stage would you? Because obviously it's a bit like people go to university, but one of the things about going to university is you build a network for your life of people you contact.
Indeed.
Now, for all its faults, in prison you will meet a lot of interesting people, or you've got the opportunity.
Absolutely.
And they're not all hard criminals, some of them for whatever circumstances. At what stage will you be allowed to communicate with them again? Will you be able to meet up with them, go out for a meal or something like that?
Well, some of us have restrictions to say that if you've been convicted of a sexual offence, you cannot have contact with someone else who has done that. Now, as I understand, after 10 years from your conviction, you can apply to be taken off that. Also, the rules only apply in Jersey, so the rules in other jurisdictions are down to the particular courts and the police in that particular place. So, for example, if I were to fly up to, say, live in Japan, for instance, then the Japanese government may say that's perfectly okay to have that kind of contact with someone. But it is a big dilemma, and I actually didn't really think about it at the time, but particularly when you're convicted of a more controversial offence, excuse me, is actually those kind of people are only the ones you can actually trust in an innate way, because of course
Right.
you can trust them not to simply turn on you because you've been convicted of something controversial, because they
Right.
have too, of course. But sadly, the law is the law, so we have to do this.
Yes. The prospects for now is you're going to start freelance writing, or you're going to get employment as a writer.
That is my hope, to start freelancing again. Of course, I'm currently under this personal restriction where I have to be supervised whilst using the internet.
Right.
But as I said, this was as I said, this is something I hope to appeal via the Royal Court. I have to see, of course, that the court are feeling sympathetic to our arguments. But certainly, even since I've been in prison, it's clear to me now that the internet's become so integrated into our daily lives. For example, during the COVID pandemic, we had the COVID Track and Trace app.
Right.
And actually, during my time in prison, the officers obviously aren't allowed to have the mobile phones on the wings. One of the officers came on duty and his phone pinged to say he'd been in contact with someone tested positive. He himself had actually contracted the coronavirus without knowing it.
Really?
And of course, he didn't see notification on his phone, so he ended up accidentally transmitting that to a couple of prisoners, myself included.
I mean,
I was
no-
absolutely fine. It was no problem at all.
Obviously, they did have COVID at the prison. I don't know how many prisoners.
We
caught
did,
it.
and it was well tested. It was very
Was
well
it?
taken care of.
Was it?
Absolutely. But, at first, they took some time to adapt. They simply banged us all up for about 3 or 4 days. But then a number of us went on hunger strike or started banging
did you?
outdoors. And eventually, the prison said, "You know what? We might actually allow people out for a little bit of fresh air, for a shower, that kind of stuff." That sort of, and we got them. I did complain to the governor at the time. I pointed out that they'd had over a year to prepare some kind of contingency plan for this, but apparently they had to check with the.
Unfortunately, this conversation, you're making me think of all sorts of areas I want to discuss with you.
Well, indeed, quite so.
I'm afraid the public will probably already be asleep now.
Quite so, quite so.
So we better stop. But last word, last thought.
Well, as I say, the main message I'd like to get out there is I have actually, want to be clear, I have no issue at all with the concept of someone going to prison because they've broken the law. The important thing is to make sure, as I said, we don't do anything to make the prison life more difficult than it has to be. Bear in mind that deprivation of liberty is the punishment, and make sure we actually do something effective with them when they're there. That's all I want to say.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Of course.